Why don't more designers and architects do their own photography? Right now, this is an invaluable skill because if your work can't be viewed somewhere online, it may as well almost not exist at all. Today, it's almost as if you have to show your work and personal brand through photography online unless you want to get left behind. But the real question is, why go through with all the hard work of creating something if it's not going to be shown at its very best? This is why large companies will spend hundreds, if not thousands of dollars on photography and film to showcase their hard work. But if you're anything like me, this isn't something that you have the budget for, so why don't we learn to do it ourselves? In this video, I want to show you that taking great photographs is not as hard as you may think, and that in my opinion as an architect and architectural photographer, there are only really 4 fundamental rules for architectural or product photography that I think every designer and creative should know, even if the only camera you own is the surprisingly capable one in your pocket. It's kinda crazy to me that so many people go out and buy new cameras these days only to proceed to leave the whole thing in auto all the time, without seriously considering how to operate the camera's manual settings. I can confess that I was definitely guilty of this throughout my university years, but once I understood the 3 basic elements of exposure, known as the exposure triangle, I found it's really quite simple, so I'm going to explain this in the simplest terms possible. You have essentially 3 ways that you can allow light into a camera: aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. And if you think of them as ingredients, the way that they're balanced to let the correct amount of light in has different effects on how the image looks. But use too much of one or the other and you can easily end up overcooking or undercooking your image. Aperture is essentially how big the hole in your lens is for light to get in. Shutter speed is how long the shutter stays open when allowing that light in, and ISO is the setting for how sensitive your sensor is to the light that the shutter speed and the aperture have allowed inside the camera. When you set your camera to auto, your camera mixes the settings of these 3 things together to create a microwave meal image that is properly exposed. But you have no control of what's gone into it, which is why you never end up with images like those that you covet from big brands. So as a cook, how you mix the proportions of these 3 ingredients to get the perfect exposure will have very different effects on your image. I now almost never touch the auto function and I shoot manual to give me full control of these 3 things, but you'll be pleased to hear that for architectural photography, you can actually leave 2 of these settings the same almost all of the time. The first setting that you want to never change is ISO, which should always be as low as possible. Although you can leave this on auto or even crank it really high, doing so makes the image noisy, which tends to look terrible. So for the most part, you want to keep this on its lowest setting at all times, which is typically somewhere around 100. Aperture, which is the size of the opening for light in your lens, allows more light in the wider that you set it. However, the side effect of this is that it makes your background more out of focus the wider that you set it. So if you're doing things like portraits or even YouTube videos, a nice wide aperture is actually great, as you don't want unnecessary elements in your background or your foreground distracting people from your subject's face. In architecture and design photography, however, context is crucial, which is why you ideally want everything in focus. So to do this, you want to shoot at around f8, which reduces your exposure but ensures that the whole image remains in focus. And as a side effect, shooting at this aperture tends to maximize the sharpness of your image too, which tends to be worse at the more extreme ends of your aperture range. Finally, as you basically want to shoot everything with these 2 settings all the time, the one setting that you'll vary is your shutter speed. Because the ISO and the aperture have been set to allow a minimal amount of light in, this is where you need to make up for that lost light. Because a longer shutter speed causes the shutter to stay open for longer, this makes everything that moves during this time frame blurry. Thankfully, buildings and products don't tend to move around, so you can be sure to get your entire subject and context sharp and in focus. What's great about these settings is that the extended shutter speed also allows things that move around your subject to blur, like cars and pedestrians, which in architectural photography helps to tell a story and create movement in a scene without distracting from the main subject. What you may have noticed, however, is that the only problem with this is that it isn't something that's possible handheld, even if you have hands as steady as a neurosurgeon. So this leads me to the next rule, which, although simple, is arguably the most important of them all. Because getting the very best out of your images using these settings requires a steady surface, you have to use a tripod. I know this is probably something that you don't want to hear, as nobody likes the idea of lugging around a tripod, but if you really want to take great architectural photography, you actually have no choice, so you either have to commit to using one or accept that your photos will probably remain mediocre. On the plus side, tripods are actually pretty affordable these days, and because cameras are just getting lighter and lighter, you don't actually need to spend a lot on one, so the ones that I recommend are small travel tripods with quick release plates which fit inside of a backpack and make this inconvenience a little bit more tolerable, which is really all you want. Using a tripod will ensure that your camera remains perfectly still while you take the shot, and additionally it gives you the freedom to fine-tune its position in order to guarantee that the photo has zero camera shake. The one thing, however, that can still mess up your shot is nudging the camera as it shoots, which can unfortunately come from simply pressing down the shutter. So to avoid this, by using the 2 seconds timer function on your camera, it gives you the freedom to take your hand off the camera whilst it takes the photo, removing any chance of camera shake. And if you want to speed things up, you can also get a handy little remote which does the same job and guarantees that you end up with images that are tack sharp. Also, by using a remote and a timer, this allows you to put yourself in the scene too, as sometimes a scene may feel that it's lacking movement or a human presence. So by using your camera's timer or a remote, you can capture yourself or a friend walking through the scene as you play around with how much motion blur you want by adjusting your shutter speed and either closing or widening your aperture to compensate for the change in exposure. When you've figured out how to use your camera, it's now important to consider how your subject is really captured at its best, and also how it's experienced in the real world. For example, when working with buildings, they are normally straight for the most part, and when they were designed, this is also how they were drawn, which is face on according to what architects call an elevation. However, it's unfortunate that because of the way that cameras work when compared to our human eyes, they create converging lines when you point one up towards the top of a building or towards a ceiling, and this means that things start to look as if they're leaning backwards, which results in an unpleasant and peculiar looking image. The thing is, you often have to point your camera upwards to get the entire subject inside your frame, and to solve this, professional photographers use tilt shift lenses, which allow the camera to remain parallel to the ground plane whilst also shifting the image upwards to capture the top of your subject. I actually have one of these back home, and although it's super sharp and works incredibly well, it's manual focus only and it's incredibly heavy and expensive, which means that I never want to take it out. Thankfully, in case you don't have one of these, converging lines can all be corrected in software and even on your phone. But with software like Lightroom and Photoshop, or even using free software such as GIMP, this can be done really easily to ensure that your building lines are parallel and perpendicular to each other, using the lens correction, scaling, and perspective tools. Hardcore pixel peepers will argue with you that this isn't really the best way to solve this problem, but realistically, most architectural photography is either viewed at low resolutions online or printed in magazines, and they're rarely ever blown up to be on billboards or shown in galleries. So in my humble opinion, for the average photographer, pixel stretching within reason is perfectly acceptable. Finally, there's nothing worse than coming home from a shoot to find out that part of your image is over or underexposed. So to stop this from happening, you can shoot in a setting called bracketed, which takes 3 simultaneous photos at 3 different exposures, so you can use the best parts of each image. You can switch up how this works inside your camera settings, but basically, when your camera's on a tripod, you end up with 3 identical images to work from that cover a wide range of exposures, which allows you to overlay these images in your editing software and blend them together so that you never end up with a part of an image that's over or underexposed. And this is super handy on sunny days or when shooting indoors towards a bright light source like a window. Of course, as you should be shooting in RAW and not JPEG, you'll be capturing the most possible data to your camera anyway, which gives you more flexibility in post. But even then, it's not always possible to recover all of the details of an over or underexposed image. So by shooting bracketed, you're ensured to save yourself from a lot of heartache later on. In addition, when shooting for the edit, there are often a lot of obstructions that tend to get in the way of the subjects that we shoot, such as pedestrians, traffic, and litter. So it's a good idea to capture several images of these shots to make sure that you have options to choose from when you get back to editing. So again, you can overlay the images and mask out the bits that you don't want. Then you can remove all additional distractions and fluff using tools like the clone stamp in Photoshop so that the image is as compelling as possible, which is handy for things like power lines, branches, and overhanging street lamps. To wrap things up, I know that a lot of the things in this video probably seem pretty hardcore, especially if you've never done anything like this before. However, anyone can implement these techniques even with just a phone and a tripod, and there are plenty of apps that let you control ISO and shutter speed to drastically improve even phone shots from their auto settings. And when you consider that most phone cameras come with the perfect focal length for architectural photography, when you stick them on a tripod, you can transform your phone into a surprisingly capable tool, and you may be shocked as to how great these images turn out when you dial down your phone's ISO. But if you already have your own camera with interchangeable lenses, I'd just say that you make sure that you have a decent piece of glass attached to the front of it, as the kit lenses that come with most cameras are renowned for being soft and mushy. So in case you want to start taking things a little bit more seriously, a wide-angle prime lens can make all the difference, as they are known for being incredibly sharp, lightweight, and affordable because they don't have the same weight and complexity as a zoom lens. And third-party lens companies like Samyang and Rokinon make great affordable glass for both full-frame and APS-C Sony mirrorless cameras. Hopefully you guys found this video helpful, and if so, make sure you drop a like and a comment. And of course, I've left links to all of my gear and recommendations down in the description below. I'll just say that if you're a designer or a design enthusiast, your understanding of composition, material, and light puts you at a huge advantage when it comes to photography. So you really have no excuse not to, as you have no idea what doors this simple skill may open up. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.